So what our overall wood markets sort of look like? I'll give a very brief overview. Focus it down a little bit on the state of South Carolina, and then proceed from there. And then I'll wrap up by talking a little bit about some research that has been done, and which I'll share with you regarding some of the perceptions about wood use in non-residential construction, in tall buildings specifically, and some of the economic significance of expanding wood markets. So, being an international trade guy, I sort of like to look at the world as a whole first, and then try to focus in more specifically here to the U.S. and then down to the region and to South Carolina. And I thought it would be interesting for everyone to sort of, especially folks who are not familiar with the wood products industry, to look at global industrial roundwood production, global wood production actually. And this is a graph of total global wood production, and it takes two forms really. There's industrial roundwood, which is used for products, and then wood fuel, which is used for cooking. Now, you probably can't see a lot of these graphs that I'm going to show up, so I'll try to describe them as best as I can. The red bars on the bottom is the industrial roundwood. The light tan on the top is wood fuel. Now, this is not wood fuel as in wood pellets. This is wood fuel that half the world uses for cooking and heating, mostly in third world countries. Much of the world still depends on wood for those very basic life's needs. Interesting about this graph is that if you look at it, and you can see from about 1961 up to the early 1990s, it's a fairly steep incline, fairly steeply upward sloping incline, suggesting that wood use, particularly industrial roundwood use, was going up fairly rapidly. In fact, it increased in that period on a compounded annual growth rate of about 1.4%. But since the 1990s, it has flattened out. This is globally, which is sort of very interesting, despite the fact that our economies are growing and population is growing. And in large part, that is due to the tremendous increases in utilization and productivity. So that we've transferred, for example, in that later period, after the late 80s, early 1990s, here in this country, for example, from using a lot of softwood plywood to using OSB. We're using recycled fiber for pulp and paper and a variety of other things that has increased our utilization and productivity rates. An additional factor is also that, especially in the last several years, we've experienced, particularly here in the U.S., a major recession that has led to a reduction in housing construction and hence industrial wood use. This is production of industrial wood here in the United States. The two bars, the big bar on the bottom is softwood. The smaller bar on top is hardwood. About 70% of what we produce in the U.S. is softwood, 30% or so is hardwood. And again, the big drop-off started in the mid-2000s because of the big recession. Housing starts and softwood lumber consumption. There is almost a perfect correlation between wood use in the softwood lumber use in the United States and housing, and this graph just sort of highlights that. Housing is starting to pick up again. We were at a level of about 2.2 million starts per year back in 2005. We're now to about 1.1 million, but we had been a lot lower than that a few years ago, and it's slowly coming back up. And here is just monthly housing starts showing the Southeast region and South Carolina specifically. And for the most part, South Carolina mirrors the rest of the nation. As you can see, we had that big drop-off, but now the recovery is well underway. I'm just going to mention pulp and paper a little bit, just because it helps provide some context in wood use generally. The top graph here is U.S. consumption of paper and paperboard. And what's kind of noticeable about that line is that it also generally sloping upward up until the early 2000s when it took a pretty heavy drop-off. And the reason for that is in pulp and paper, two large segments of the pulp and paper industry are newsprint and printing and writing. Well, Newsprint is now basically in a gopher's basement because we don't read a lot of newspapers as much as we used to, and printing and writing is not doing that much better. We're not writing checks as much as we used to. A lot of transactions are electronics and so forth. Fortunately, here in South Carolina, the pulp and paper industry has done very, very well. Most of the closures in the pulp and paper industry have occurred in the Northeast and North Central states. All right, turning now to new construction, which is a value of construction, which is what we're talking about this afternoon. This is a graph that shows both residential and non-residential construction by value in the United States over time. Again, the recession, Great Recession, is very, very obvious. One thing to note is that the value of non-residential construction generally tends to be a little bit less affected during periods of recession than housing. While housing really took a big hit in 2007, 2008, non-residential construction took a slightly less of a hit. In part, that's also because a lot of projects are publicly funded, and during times of recession, a lot of governments, state, local, even the federal government, institute stimulus policies that help to that fund various non-residential construction projects. What I'm showing here, by the way, is just non-residential building. There's another part of non-residential construction, which includes infrastructure, bridges, and that kind of thing. But we wanted to focus just on building today. And this is just a graph that kind of compares South Carolina with South Atlantic region in the U.S. And for the most part, South Carolina has been, the economy here in the state has been recovering at a pace a little bit faster than the U.S. as a whole and the South Atlantic states. This is a pie chart that shows softwood lumber. Softwood lumber is the single largest wood products that is consumed in the United States. Obviously we have, as Tim and others pointed out this morning, there are panel products and a variety of other wood building materials that are utilized. Softwood lumber is a good sort of index or indicator of trends, wood consumption and consumption in construction generally. Housing represents, residential construction represents the major use for softwood lumber in the United States. Between new housing and repair and remodeling on existing housing, you're looking at about 60% of softwood lumber consumption. Non-residential building, which is the circled in red, represents only about 7% of softwood lumber consumption in the United States. Now, my task for this project was to try to figure out two things. First, to look at the non-residential construction market, particularly here in South Carolina, look at the trends. But more importantly, to look at wood use in non-residential construction to try to figure out, well, what are the opportunities for expanding the use of wood in non-residential building? Residential building, wood owns that market. 90+% of all residential construction is constructed using wood framing. But that's not the case in non-residential building. It's a complicated issue in non-residential construction. In residential construction, if you tell me the number of single-family starts or the number of multifamily starts, we have very good data and can estimate fairly accurately the amount of wood that's going to be used. In non-residential building construction, it's more complicated, largely because buildings vary so much. They vary by size, they vary by design. In any given year, the types of buildings that may go up could be very different in a particular state or locality than the previous year or the year following. So in one year, you may see 2 hospitals going up. In the next year, it may be a multi-use office and apartment building. So it's very, very difficult with any kind of precision to really focus in on the exact amount of wood that's being used in non-residential building, except in a particular point in time and using a variety of assumptions. But that's what I attempted to do here. There's a variety of different data sources that I depended on for this purpose, Census Bureau obviously being one of them. There are a couple of national studies by the Forest Service and by APA, the Engineered Wood Association, that have looked at wood use in non-residential construction nationally. And there's also a couple of good private databases. One of them is CMD Group. Architects and contractors may be familiar with that. They try to keep track of every construction project that is occurring in various stages of development, I might add. So for South Carolina, for example, I recently looked up, and there are apparently about 600 non-residential building projects currently in various stages of development in the state. Anyway, that information was kind of very helpful to me as well. This is a graph that's showing the value of non-residential building construction in South Carolina. In 2014, I figured it was about close to $5 billion, $4.9 billion. Again, you see the effect of the recession, but it is starting to come back. Okay, this is kind of a interesting set of pie charts. On the left side is the value of building construction. These are national figures here. Value of building construction. Remember the earlier graph that showed the trend line, and I pointed out that about half, well, I should have pointed out that about half of it was residential and half of it non-residential. And here we see that, exactly half of the value of new building construction, I think this data is for 2014, was residential and about half is non-residential. But on the right side, it shows an estimate of what the market share of that non-residential market and the residential markets are for wood. So 88% of the wood that's used is used in residential construction, and only about 12% is used in non-residential construction. And that sort of tells you kind of where we are in that market. And this is wood framing in non-residential construction by opportunity. So in that section that is non-wood based, this is the breakdown of types of buildings that could conceivably, given the codes, be wood framed construction. So the big areas are healthcare, hotels, stores, and education. And once again, this is just for South Carolina. The data is similar, not exactly the same. The big segments of the construction market are commercial, office, and healthcare. It's on the left side. Currently, wood use by building type is a little bit different. A lot is going into lodging, hotels, commercial, and healthcare, and a fair amount's going into educational buildings. These are the numbers that are detailed more specifically. As you can see, the second line is the non-residential buildings, and for South Carolina, as I noted, it's $4.9 billion. Part of that is public, about $1.5 billion of value of construction is public, private is $3.4 billion. About 70% of the value of non-residential building construction in South Carolina are what I would consider low to mid-rise buildings up to 6 stories. Those are the buildings that typically have the greatest potential to use more wood products. This is my estimate of how much wood is actually used in non-residential construction in South Carolina by building type. So a lot of it's going into the hotel sector, some in the office, commercial, healthcare, and so forth. About 50% of the wood material is in the form of lumber, about 32% in structural panels, 18% in engineered wood products, and a small percent in other kinds of panel products and other products. Altogether, it comes out to about 20 million board feet. Now, to give you some sense of what the potential is here or where we are in relation to the total market. Here in South Carolina, I believe, and Tim's got to help me with this at some point to make sure this estimate is approximately right, but I think here in South Carolina, we produce approximately 1 billion board feet of softwood lumber. We are using 20 million board feet in the non-residential building market. So you can see that a very, very small percentage of what we're producing is actually going into this market. But what that tells you is that there's a huge potential to increase the amount of wood that's used in this market. So what are the barriers? This is some information that I came across that may shed some light on that question. We heard today, Paul noted that building codes are really not a major inhibiting factor. So why is it that we're not using more? There was some discussion, I think, about the fact that we're not teaching a lot about wood frame construction in our architectural programs, and I'm sure it plays a role in that. This is information from a survey that was conducted by an architect in North Carolina, and she had the idea, or she wanted to find out how tall wood buildings might be perceived amongst different cross-sections of the population. She surveyed some 518 people, many of whom were in the building trades, many were not, and identified a number of barriers or perceptions about tall wood buildings and measured what it was about tall wood buildings that struck them as being problematic. And the perception that came out on top was wood is flammable, the building will burn quickly. So flammability, at least in this survey, was identified as a perception that is problematic. The second most common barrier is the strength of wood cannot compare to steel and concrete, so strength. The third, building more of our tall buildings with wood will deplete our forests, sustainability issue. A lot of people, I guess, just have not gotten the message from Gene and Tim that we're growing more wood today than we ever did before. And the fourth one down, wood is less durable than steel and concrete. Interestingly, younger respondents in this survey were less familiar with wood products used in high-rise buildings than older respondents. In general, men were more familiar with engineered wood than women, but women had a somewhat higher favorable aesthetic perception of wood. So for what that's worth, that's some interesting findings by Shauna Hammond, who was the architect who did this particular survey. So sort of to wrap up, the current market share for wood frame buildings in the non-residential building sector is relatively low. 12% might be as high as 15%. A little bit depends on how you measure it. If you're looking at like 4-story buildings or less, the market share is probably higher. If you start looking at 10 stories or less, the market share actually goes down just because of the nature of the numbers. A 1% increase in the market share in South Carolina, 1% increase in the non-residential market share for wood translates to a 9% increase in wood demand in the state. So if we can increase that 12% to 13%, we have a 9% increase in the amount of wood that's used in those buildings. So what has to happen for that? Well, clearly we have to set the perception straight related to fire performance and durability and sustainability, change outdated prohibitions on fire retardant treated wood products, which we talked about earlier, champion innovative wood designs in building assemblies, and also analyze the economics of designs using wood materials. I did talk to a number of architects, and one or two noted that for some designs, the use of wood either is problematic or can be more expensive. So more information on the economics of using wood in various designs would probably be useful. Thank you very much.